Good morning and welcome, almost good afternoon. We are not officially getting started yet, but wanted to open up the webinar for anybody coming in early. See a couple people. Regina, can you hear me okay? Let me know in the chat. And then I see some other folks, which I'm not sure if you are actually all the way logged on, but if you can, if you want to say hello, you can use the chat. And we just have a few minutes until we officially start. Great. Hey, Lynn. Good. So we look good, I think. Hey, Louise. Hey, Louise, just curious, are you logged in through a computer or through your phone? Or we're still trying to figure out some of the logistics of what we see on the back end here of folks logged in and what the status is. Hey, Donna. Good morning, everyone. We will get started in just a few minutes. Hi, Bruce. Welcome. All right. Just about one more minute. Hi, Regina. Oh, okay, Louise. I see that, yeah, we could only communicate through chat. Only the speakers and moderators have the audio capability, the two-way audio capability. Hello. All right, so we're right at 12 o'clock and want to be respectful of everyone's time and start and end on time. Hi, Clarice. So would like to welcome everybody, say good afternoon, and welcome everybody to our quarterly, as of now, quarterly webinar series brought to you by FlexPro. And the topic of today's webinar is Project Risk. I'm going to go through just a couple of logistics before we really get started. A few of you have been using the chat before we got on here, but please use the chat for any kind of public conversation. It will be shared with all the other participants on the webinar, and anything you want to ask that's private, you could use the questions tab. And any questions in there will only be visible by myself and the other speakers and moderators. There is a polls tab. You might see something pop up saying that there's a new poll to take. We encourage you to take them. It gives us some insight on who our audience is and how things are going. And finally, at the end of this webinar, there will be a recording, and you should get a link to the replay in your email, since everyone online here would be registered. So, as I said, the webinar today is brought to you by FlexPro. The FlexPro group is delivering project management expertise to the life sciences. You could find us on our webpage, www.theflexprogroup.com. You could also find us on LinkedIn and on Facebook. Please reach out, get connected, and stay in the loop with the latest in both the life sciences and project management. So, speakers for today, we have Rose Cook, PMP, and our CEO here at FlexPro, Ken Sabata, also a PMP and Senior Project Manager, and myself, I'm Francisco Buella, also a Senior Project Manager. So what are we going to learn today? First, the reason why for risk management. Why is it important? Why should we pay attention to it? What are the steps to plan for and identify risk? And finally, how do you go about managing risk once we have it identified? And with that, I'll kick it off and hand it over to Rose, who will just tell you a little bit more.
Hi, and thanks everybody for joining, sharing your lunch hour with us. For those of you that might be on the West Coast, good morning. And I'd like to start off today with a quote that you see on your screen. It's from a renowned business guru, Jack Welch, and it sets the stage for our discussion on risk management, and I'll just read it. It says, "Face reality as it is, not as it was or as you wish it to be." And the reason I selected that is really to focus on the idea of reality, because the first step in the management of risk is to really acknowledge the reality of risk. As positive and as optimistic as we all like to be, the reality is that most projects just don't go exactly to plan. I think those of you that have run projects know that that's the truth. And as project managers, it's really a critical part of our role to encourage an open dialogue about what can go wrong. Focus for a few minutes to do the risk management planning. I'd encourage you all to work with your project sponsor, whoever's heading up and sponsoring the project, to create what I would call a safe environment in which to voice your issues. I know some organizations would kind of frown upon talking about the potential threats. They want to believe the project's always going to go perfectly well. But you don't want to deny that things might go south. It doesn't make the threats go away. That's just the reality. So denial of the problems just makes us miss out on this opportunity to plan well for the potential problems. So if you look on this chart we have on the screen right now, you'll see a big red panic button on the right side. No one wants to be the one that's going to press the panic button anytime within a project. But as a project manager, you're usually the one responsible for letting people know when there's a problem. So understanding the importance of risk management is critical. So if you look at this graph, when you move from left to right, it represents moving in time from when you're project planning early on to project execution later on as you move to the right. And the red line represents your ability to change your risk exposure. So as you go through the project, your ability to manage and control your risks decreases. And then conversely, if you look at the blue line, that represents the costs that are associated with mitigating your risks. So those costs increase as you go to the end of your project. So in a nutshell, what I'm trying to say here is that the key is to manage your risk as early as possible. And then also to say that it's important to understand that the job of the project manager is not so much to be like a hero in dealing with unknown problems. Yeah, it would be great if you can deal with those problems, but what would be better is really to prevent the problems whenever possible. Early prevention of problems is the goal. And if you do your job right, you won't ever have to hit that panic button. Okay, so next, Senior Project Manager and PMP, Ken Sabata, on our team, will begin to outline the risk management process.
Good afternoon. So let's talk about what the risk management process entails. The very first step is plan. So risk management planning is an organizational assessment considering the appetite, the tolerance, and the threshold the organization has to risk. Then you want to identify your risk, step 2. You start this during the project planning process, but it's an ongoing process throughout the life of the project. You want to document potential problems. You'll review previous projects, living into that adage that those that refuse to learn from the past are doomed to repeat it. And out of that process of identification, you'll end up with a robust list of project risks. Then you're going to move to step 3, and that's to evaluate those risks. Now, you're going to want to use a method that's understood and meaningful, and actually, most importantly, acceptable to your organization and your stakeholders. Out of that evaluation process, you'll have determined which risks are of a higher nature versus lower nature. And then you're going to want to develop, fourthly, a response plan. And this is typically, the responses can be to avoid risk, to transfer it, to mitigate it, or to accept it. And through that process, you would also put together any estimations of cost or time implications. So where we'd like to go now is let's talk about how one goes about the risk management planning process in a little more detail. As the project manager, you typically define the level of risk management you will do for your project. But before you do that, it's important to consider the organizational culture and the risk appetite of your key stakeholders. So let's take a look at this chart. We talk about risk appetite, and that's determining what are the preferences of the organization and the stakeholders. And we look at home cooked meal versus fast food with the analogy, are you staying within budget? Is that the most important thing? In terms of risk tolerance, how much will the organization allow you to take on? A small serving of risk, or they're acceptable to a full plate? Are we willing to accept a 1 to 4 week schedule slip in order to stay within our budget? And then risk threshold. What and at what point will you leave the table? In other words, are you still hungry? You can accommodate some more risk, or are you stuffed and you've had too much? Schedule slips greater than 4 weeks or a 5% increase in the budget require a higher level of organizational decision-making in terms of how you proceed with the project. It's really important to recognize that governance bodies have standardized definitions for risk tolerance and thresholds, but risk appetite really can vary from project to project. And it's really a good idea to determine the project risk appetite through your stakeholder management process. Like any human endeavor, projects need to be performed and delivered under certain constraints. Traditionally, these constraints have been listed as scope, time, and cost. These are also referred to as the project management triangle, where each side represents a constraint. Now, as you look at one side of the triangle, it cannot be changed without affecting the others. So take a look at poor Dilbert here. He's struggling to manage the schedule, resource, and scope constraints with his manager. You have planned and now have an understanding of the risk appetite and tolerance and threshold of your organization. You need to consider the impacts of those risks, biases from your stakeholders when managing the triple constraint. If your organization prefers schedule over cost and their risk tolerance is high, well then, with no established thresholds, your project will most likely compete for resources with other organizational project commitments, and dates can in fact slip. Now that you have planned for risk management, let's see how one goes about identifying the risks. Okay. So risk identification is the process of identifying all of the uncertainty and constraints in your project. Now let's talk about where to look for those risks. So where you want to, on the chart on the slide here is an example of a risk breakdown structure. And you're going to want to take a look at the different risk categories. It can be, they can come in the form of technical risks. They can come in the form of external risks. For instance, there's regulatory changes or market changes that could impact the project. Organizational changes related to the availability of resources or funding in the organization. And then clearly project management risk areas tied into how well did the team do their estimating and planning. So as you look through those, you can also look through the project plan tied into the tasks that have been planned for, and so that you can understand what the risks are related to the tasks. You also want to take a look at interviewing your stakeholders, get their inputs, and then you can run risk workshops and with your team as time permits, and that'll allow you to get a really good handle on where things stand. I think it's important to recognize that many people get confused with risk category and risk impact. There is no such thing as a cost risk, schedule risk, or scope risk. For example, a schedule slip of 3 weeks in your project due to the line being used for a qualification is an impact, not a risk. The real risk is the dependency of the project during the qual, which is organizational dependency risk. Let's move on and take a look at risk analysis. With a risk list compiled, you want to determine how to evaluate those risks. It involves prioritizing, whether that means just a simple acceptable, unacceptable threshold switch that you've aligned with the organization, or using a little more sophisticated tool that's shown here, which is a risk priority index. As the scorecard legend shows, some organizations then standardize the definitions for risk levels, tolerances, and thresholds so that you know how you can proceed with any of the risks. Or if none exists, then you want to work with the organization to define them. You can see here that if it's a lower risk score, then the organization says, go ahead and proceed. Or if it's a little bit higher, proceed with caution. And then you can go to mitigate, or you can sit there and say, nope, this is a stop. We're not moving any further until we address this issue. You can look at it in that risk priority index table, or you can actually look at it on a risk cube, which also helps you understand the heightened level of risk. Now, let's talk about how to respond to these prioritized risks. So, as we mentioned earlier, you can take avoidance, and avoidance is your strongest response. This means you're taking steps to remove the risk altogether. Typically requires a modification of scope. For instance, let's remove component F from the formula since it's never been used before with the other components in the formula. You can transfer the risk, and this involves moving the risk to another party, making them accountable for managing it. It does not eliminate the risk. That's important to understand. It needs to be logged and it needs to be tracked in your risk register. An example would be supplier XYZ has more experience with that particular type of analysis. Let's have them do the testing. You can mitigate a risk. And basically what that is a reduction of the risk to the lowest possible acceptable level within the organization. So an example here would be we purchase a more expensive material in the hopes that we can reduce the likelihood of nonconformance or issues in use. And finally, you can accept or assume risk. And what that basically means is you're agreeing to accept the outcome of the risk. If supplier XYZ can't provide the test data before the end of the month, then we're agreeing that we will push the date out. I'm now going to pass it back to Rose for some closing thoughts.
Hey, everyone. Just a few closing thoughts as Ken has wrapped up sharing some tools with us today. And what I'd like to say is really reinforce a bit of what I said at the beginning, is that while we can't possibly plan for every risk and anticipate everything that can go wrong, at the very, very least, I'd encourage you all to open up a team dialogue on the reality of risk. Find a way to encourage the discussion. And the key thing is to make it safe. Make it a safe environment to bring up these potential problems. You don't want a fear of retribution. It needs to be a safe place where you encourage people to talk about what can go wrong and that we will positively, try to work on mitigating these things that can go wrong. And then once you've created that environment and encouraged the dialogue, slowly introduce some of the tools that Ken has shown you today, because whether you discuss the risks or not, they still exist. And your project will, I guarantee you, have a change of course, whether you plan for it or not. And as Ben Franklin on this slide reminds us, change is the only constant in life, and one's ability to adapt to those changes will determine your success in life. So we need a plan for it. Great. So next, what we're going to do is, as we have wrapped up some thoughts today, we'd like to move into a Q&A session where Ken will come back on stage to answer some of these questions. And as Cisco mentioned to you before, there is a questions tab. It's listed on your sheet. And if you would be so kind as to throw some questions our way, we will be happy to answer them. And we'll spend the next couple of minutes doing that. Let me see what we've got here. So, okay, so we have a question coming in. Ken, welcome back.
Thank you.
Thank you. What is an example of a risk and how you mitigated it?
Okay, thanks, Rose. Certainly. Ran into a situation once where I was working on a project that basically took a capability within the organization offline. In other words, it had to be decommissioned, rebuilt, and then recommissioned and validated. And this was a laboratory capability that was supporting the manufacturing operation. So it was critical that that capability come back online at a specific point in time in order for the overall organizational goals to be met. And what was recognized is that if it slipped, this was a real risk to the organization coming back up. So what we did was we, in recognizing that, we looked at potential ways to mitigate that risk. And what we opted to do was bring on outside test lab capability, get it qualified to support us. And in point of fact, it did become necessary to utilize that capability as other issues within the within the project necessitated a slip in the capability of the labs coming back online. So it was a change in scope. It was a required additional funding to do all that, and actually resources in the organization to manage working with an external supplier. But it was a good thing to do because it became necessary and did keep the overall project on schedule.
Right. So, yes. So another question that we're getting here is, what do you do if team members just don't want to voice or document what can go wrong?
Well, that is a challenge. So I think one of the, and I think you mentioned it earlier in the presentation, Rose, part of the key role of project manager is to make sure that you have a dynamic on your team where the team members feel comfortable with each other and an open ability to communicate. That said, they might be feeling pressure from higher levels of management not to voice things or keep things under wraps. But at the end of the day, risks do need to get out into the open and discussed at least by the team. So if that means that the project manager needs to keep his own sort of log and work with the team closely to manage that, I think that's where you really have to go. And the team needs to recognize that the project manager does have the responsibility to communicate up to senior leadership the risks, and he or she in a manner that keeps the team, if there's any fear of reprisals or anything from saying something, he or she can act as that buffer.
Great. Great. Okay. Another question, somewhat similar to what you were just talking about, Ken, is coming in. And it basically says, what would we recommend to a PM whose leadership doesn't like to talk about risk? I guess we covered a little bit of that, but I'll take a stab at this and say that I would meet with the leader separately and really try to have that leader, that sponsor, understand why calling out what could go wrong is actually a good thing. Because when you encourage the dialogue about what could go wrong, other creative ideas come out, and actually sometimes even what they sometimes call positive risks end up coming out of that discussion. And essentially it's opportunities, opportunities to accelerate or something come out of these kind of dialogues. So the key is, I would say, meet with that senior leadership person and just try to talk about what the benefits are of having this discussion. A couple other questions here I'm trying to digest, and then I'll shoot them out to the group. So another question's coming in here. Based on your experience, Ken, are there recommended actions based on the risk category? If you can try to interpret what that means.
Yeah, so I think if you go back to that slide where we had the risk that risk breakdown structure, right? There were different risk categories, whether they be organizational, technical, external, whatever. That's really a discussion you kind of need to have with your stakeholders and the organization ahead of time. And the sensitivity around it. Obviously, what I would say external risks, depending on the nature of the project, a hurricane coming through is not anything any of us can control, but yet it could take the power out, disrupt supply chain or a number of things. And so to a certain extent, if you're living in the Key West and running a project, you may just have to accept the fact that that's the nature of the beast. But for things that are a little more predictable and under your control, clearly I think it boils down to having that discussion around, is there a threshold in the organization that says we mitigate, no, these we accept, these we transfer. And it's really a discussion. The organization may be sophisticated enough to set up thresholds to predetermine that, but I think typically it's a discussion.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Ken. There's a question here. Hi, Karthika. Thanks for joining. On how do you get to a risk budget, so to speak, for a project beforehand, right? Are there any kind of typical percentages based on best practices where one could use up front? You know, how do you, because obviously risk, you know, managing it is going to cost you. Like, how do you get to that beforehand?
I think my experience with this, in all honesty, is a little bit limited because what I have found typically is that a lot of organizations assume 100% success on their projects, and then somebody up in the senior leadership pool has a budget when the things start going off the rails a little bit. But I think my also experience just from observing is that if a project is of a nature that it's repeatable, in other words, it's a type of project that the organization has done before, and they have done a good job of monitoring and controlling that project and capturing data out of that project, then you have a sense of what are the kind of risks you might run into and what did they cost you. So we talked about identifying risks and capturing lessons learned. Hey, this happened before, the likelihood, and that cost us this much to mitigate or avoid. You know, in all likelihood, we could run into that again on this particular project. That's a way to, in the upfront planning process, to try and get some money set aside for it. But in a lot of cases, it really depends on how repeatable and reproducible the projects are to prior projects. Otherwise, it's really just the team working through the process. And as you have the discussion with your stakeholders and leadership to say, hey, you know, much like what happened with me and this lab example I offered earlier, that came up, and you sit there and go, well, now we got to put together an estimate and let people know what that's going to cost. And then the organization had the opportunity to sit there and say, no, we're not going to spend money on qualifying outside labs. We'll accept the risk of not being able to start production. That it didn't take much of a cost analysis to figure out that wasn't a good idea.
And the power is in the dialogue.
Yes.
So just getting the dialogue is the most powerful thing. But in the answer to the budget too, I would say if you don't have history on the type of project, at a minimum, put a line in that says contingency. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, that's just good best practice. I mean, you can't really know if this is like an entrepreneurial project, first time done, that it's going to be, you know, 5%, 10%, 20%, but put a line in at least that says contingency in your budget.
Right.
Right. To me, put something in, you know, and then it causes the dialogue. So anyway, so those questions, we've answered a few. Thank you so much for sending those in. We always love this part of the session to interact, but we are at 12:29, and being good project managers, we're going to wrap it up since we were supposed to be here till 12:30. And just in closing, again, thank you for joining. You will be emailed a recording of this webinar for your reference. And a reminder, we will be holding these webinars periodically, quarterly, if not more. And to make sure that you know about when we're going to hold future ones, please follow us on LinkedIn. Go to LinkedIn, and we're listed as the FlexPro Group. Any future webinars or other things of use will be put out there. And as a follower, you'll get alerted. And then any other information on us, feel free to check us out on our website at www.theflexprogroup.com. So we're going to sign off, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Bye now.